The mess hall buzzed with the usual evening chatter as soldiers lined up for dinner. Steam rose from metal trays filled with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans that had seen better days. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across tired faces, most of them belonging to men who had spent the day in training exercises under the scorching desert sun. Sergeant Maya Rodriguez balanced her tray carefully as she navigated between the long tables. At 28, she had been in the Army for 8 years, but her compact frame and youthful face often made others assume she was fresh out of basic training. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform was as crisp as regulations demanded, despite the day's activities. She spotted an empty chair at a table near the back and made her way over. The conversation at the table was already in full swing, dominated by Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, whose voice carried easily over the ambient noise of the mess hall. Thompson was the kind of soldier who commanded attention wherever he went, standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of deployments across 3 continents. "I'm telling you guys, it's all about the numbers," Thompson was saying as he gestured with his fork. "In Afghanistan, I had 43 confirmed kills. That's what separates the real soldiers from the support staff." Corporal Danny Walsh, a lanky redhead from Texas, nodded enthusiastically. "Man, I remember my first firefight. The adrenaline was insane. Got 6 Taliban fighters that day. Nothing like it." Private First Class James Carter, barely 19 and eager to prove himself, leaned forward. "I can't wait for my first deployment. I want to see some real action, you know? Get my first kill." Maya sat down quietly and began eating, listening to the conversation without comment. She had heard variations of this discussion countless times before. War stories, kill counts, and bravado were common currency in the mess hall, especially among soldiers who had never seen real combat or those who needed to convince themselves that war was a game with a scoreboard. "The thing is," Thompson continued, warming to his favorite subject, "you've got to have the right mindset. Some people just aren't cut out for the killing. They freeze up when it matters. That's why certain types of soldiers get assigned to support roles." Walsh glanced around the table, and his eyes fell on Maya. "Speaking of support roles, what about the women in our unit? I mean, no offense to any ladies present, but they're not really built for combat, right? They do important work, but when it comes to actual fighting..." Thompson laughed, a sound that carried more condescension than humor. "Come on, man. Women don't get kill counts. They might carry weapons, sure, but when push comes to shove, they're not the ones pulling the trigger when it counts. It's basic biology. Men are hunters, women are gatherers. That's how it's always been." Carter nodded along, desperate to fit in with the older soldiers. "Makes sense. I mean, they can do logistics and medical stuff, but actual combat? That's different." Maya continued eating, her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that engaging in these conversations rarely ended well. Men like Thompson had already made up their minds about what women could and couldn't do, and no amount of reasoning would change their perspective. She had more important things to worry about than educating ignorant colleagues. "I read somewhere that women in combat units actually perform worse under pressure," Walsh added, clearly pleased with what he thought was scientific backing for his prejudice. "Something about how their brains are wired differently. They get emotional, can't make the hard choices." Thompson nodded sagely. "Exactly. And when lives are on the line, you need someone who can flip that switch, you know? Go from human to killer in a heartbeat. Most women just don't have that capability." The conversation was starting to attract attention from nearby tables. Other soldiers, both male and female, were beginning to listen in. Maya noticed Lieutenant Jennifer Park, a military intelligence officer, shake her head in disgust and turned back to her meal. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a supply specialist, rolled her eyes but continued her own conversation. "I mean, look around this mess hall," Thompson said, his voice getting louder as he gained confidence in his audience. "How many women do you see who actually look like warriors? They're all so small, delicate. You need size and strength for real combat." Maya was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. She had been underestimated her entire military career because of her size. What Thompson and his friends didn't know was that she had compensated for her physical limitations by becoming exceptionally skilled with weapons, tactics, and hand-to-hand combat. While they spent their evenings talking about hypothetical kills, she spent hers training. Plus, Carter added, eager to contribute to the conversation, women get distracted by emotions. If their buddy gets hurt, they'll abandon the mission to help. Men compartmentalize better. Walsh laughed. Remember that story about the female MP who supposedly saved some soldiers in Iraq? I always wondered if that was real or just propaganda to make women feel better about themselves. Maya's fork paused halfway to her mouth, but she didn't look up. The story they were referencing was likely about Jessica Lynch or one of the other female soldiers whose actions had been sensationalized by the media. The truth about women in combat was far more complex and impressive than these men understood. The bottom line, Thompson said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had made an irrefutable point, is that war is a man's business. Always has been, always will be. Women can support the mission, but when it comes to actually closing with and destroying the enemy, that's men's work. The table had grown quiet except for their conversation. Even soldiers at other tables had stopped talking to listen. Maya could feel eyes on her, waiting to see if she would respond. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few seemed to be enjoying the show. Maya finished chewing her mouthful of food and set down her fork. She looked up for the first time since sitting down, making eye contact with Thompson. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Interesting theory, she said quietly. Her voice was soft, but clear enough for the nearby tables to hear. Tell me, Staff Sergeant Thompson, how many deployments have you had? Thompson straightened up, clearly pleased to be asked about his experience. 3 tours. Afghanistan twice, Iraq once. 15 months total combat time. Maya nodded thoughtfully. And all 43 of those confirmed kills were during those deployments? That's right, Thompson said proudly. Every single one verified by my squad leader and battalion commander. Maya picked up her water glass and took a small sip. The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter. Even soldiers at distant tables had stopped their conversations, sensing that something significant was about to happen. That's impressive, Maya said, still in the same calm tone. 43 confirmed kills in 15 months. That's almost 3 per month. You must have seen some serious action. Thompson puffed up with pride. You bet I did. Real combat, not this training exercise nonsense. When bullets are flying and your buddies are counting on you, that's when you find out what you're really made of. Maya nodded again, as if considering his words carefully. The silence in the mess hall was becoming uncomfortable. Even the kitchen staff had stopped clattering dishes to listen. You know, Maya said finally, I've always wondered about those statistics. How accurate they really are. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I mean, in the chaos of battle, with multiple soldiers firing at the same targets, how can anyone be completely certain who gets credit for which kill? Thompson's expression darkened slightly. Are you questioning my combat record, Rodriguez? Maya held up her hand peacefully. Not at all. I'm sure your record is exactly as reported. I was just thinking about the broader question of combat effectiveness and how we measure it. Walsh and Carter exchanged glances, unsure where the conversation was heading. The tension at the table was becoming palpable. Maya looked around the table, making eye contact with each of the men who had been so eager to discuss women's limitations in combat. You see, I've been listening to your theories about women in combat, and I find them fascinating. Especially the part about kill counts. Thompson leaned forward aggressively. Oh yeah? And what's your expertise on the subject? Supply runs? Guard duty. Maya's expression didn't change. Actually, I've had 4 deployments. 2 to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, and 1 to Syria. 22 months total combat time. The number hung in the air like smoke. Thompson's confident expression began to falter as he processed what she had just said. 4 deployments? Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded. The Syrian deployment was particularly intense. We were embedded with special operations units for most of it. Very different kind of warfare than the conventional operations you're probably familiar with. Thompson recovered some of his bluster. Well, deployments are one thing, but did you actually see combat? Real fighting, not just convoy security or perimeter guard. Maya smiled for the first time since sitting down, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Oh yes, Staff Sergeant Thompson. I saw quite a bit of combat. In fact, that brings me to your earlier question about kill counts. The mess hall was now completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to have quieted down. Every person in the room was listening intently. You see, Maya continued, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge. You're absolutely right that kill counts matter. They're a very important metric for measuring combat effectiveness. And I think it's wonderful that you're so proud of your 43 confirmed kills. Thompson's face was beginning to flush red, though whether from anger or embarrassment wasn't clear. Maya stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She was still holding her water glass, and she took another small sip before continuing. The thing is, she said, looking directly at Thompson, I disagree with your assessment that women don't get kill counts. Because, you see, in my 4 deployments and 22 months of combat time, I have 87 confirmed kills. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of Maya setting down her water glass seemed to echo through the entire mess hall. Thompson's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. Walsh and Carter looked like they had been struck by lightning. Maya remained standing, her posture relaxed but alert. She looked around the table at the 3 men who had been so confident in their assertions about women in combat just moments before. Now, she said, her voice still perfectly calm. Would anyone like to continue the discussion about biology and combat effectiveness? Or perhaps we could talk about emotional control under pressure. I'm very interested in your theories. The aftermath of Maya's revelation spread through the mess hall like ripples on a pond. Soldiers at nearby tables began whispering among themselves, some craning their necks to get a better look at the small woman who had just claimed nearly double Thompson's kill count. The kitchen staff had completely stopped working, standing frozen with dishes in their hands as they tried to process what they had just heard. Thompson's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a deep crimson. His jaw worked silently for several seconds before he managed to find his voice. 87. That's impossible. There's no way a woman could have that many confirmed kills. You're lying. Maya remained standing, her posture relaxed but ready. Years of combat had taught her to read people's body language, and she could see Thompson's humiliation transforming into anger. Humiliated men were often dangerous, especially when their egos were threatened in front of an audience. I understand your skepticism, Maya said calmly. It is a high number. But, I assure you, every single kill has been verified through proper channels. Would you like me to provide you with my unit designations and commanding officers for verification? Walsh found his voice first. Wait. Even if that's true, which I'm not saying it is, that doesn't prove anything. Maybe you were just lucky. Maybe you had better equipment or were in more target-rich environments. Maya nodded thoughtfully. Those are fair points, Corporal Walsh. Environment and equipment certainly play a role in any soldier's effectiveness. Though I'm curious what you mean by lucky in the context of combat operations. Carter, still trying to process the information, stammered. But how? I mean, you're so small. How could you possibly kill 87 people? Maya finished the question for him. Is that what you're wondering, Private Carter? The young soldier nodded mutely, his earlier enthusiasm for discussing combat completely evaporated. Maya sat back down, but this time every eye in the mess hall remained focused on her table. It's a reasonable question. Size does matter in combat, but perhaps not in the way you think it does. She picked up a dinner roll from her tray, examining it as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. You see, when Staff Sergeant Thompson talks about his 43 kills, I imagine most of them came from standard infantry operations. Squad-level engagements, maybe some urban combat. Am I correct? Thompson nodded grudgingly, his earlier pride completely deflated. Those are legitimate combat operations, Maya continued. Dangerous work that requires courage and skill. But they're also relatively straightforward. You see the enemy, you engage the enemy, you eliminate the threat. Clear rules of engagement, established protocols. She took a bite of the dinner roll and chewed thoughtfully before continuing. My deployments were different. Special operations embed, long-range reconnaissance, counterterrorism missions. The kind of work where being small and underestimated is actually an advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the battalion commander, had entered the mess hall during Maya's revelation and was now standing near the entrance, listening intently. He was a tall, graying man with 30 years of military experience, and his presence added an official weight to the conversation. In Syria, Maya continued, we spent 3 months hunting high-value targets in urban environments. The enemy knew that American forces were operating in the area, but they were looking for teams of large, obviously Western men. They weren't looking for a small woman who could blend in with local populations. Thompson's anger was giving way to confusion. You were operating alone? Sometimes. Other times with a partner or small team. The mission parameters varied depending on the target and environment. Maya's voice remained calm, professional. Sniper work, mostly. Some close-quarters elimination when the situation required it. The revelation that Maya was a sniper sent another wave of whispers through the mess hall. Snipers were respected and feared throughout the military, considered elite soldiers regardless of their gender. The idea that the quiet woman eating dinner had been eliminating high-value targets in Syria was almost impossible for many of the soldiers to process. Walsh shook his head in disbelief. Even if that's true, special ops is different. That's not the same as regular infantry combat. Anyone can kill someone from a distance with a high-powered rifle. Maya's expression hardened slightly. It was the first crack in her calm demeanor since the conversation began. Anyone can kill from a distance, Corporal Walsh. Is that your professional assessment? Walsh began to backtrack, sensing he had crossed a line. I mean, it's not the same as close-quarters battle. Face-to-face combat where you look the enemy in the eye. Ah, Maya nodded. So you're suggesting that my kills don't count as much because they were at distance? That somehow being a sniper is easier than infantry work? Thompson, still smarting from his earlier embarrassment, jumped back into the conversation. She's got a point, Walsh. But, still, special operations is hand-picked personnel. Elite units. If Rodriguez was selected for that kind of work, it means someone thought she was qualified. That doesn't mean regular women could do the same thing. Maya smiled, but, again, it wasn't a friendly expression. You're partially correct, Staff Sergeant Thompson. Special operations personnel are indeed handpicked. But you seem to be under the impression that I was selected for special treatment because I'm a woman. Some kind of diversity initiative, perhaps? Thompson's silence was answer enough. Actually, Maya continued, I volunteered for special operations after my second deployment. My application was initially rejected. Twice. The selection committee felt that my physical profile didn't meet their requirements for the mission set. Carter leaned forward, genuinely curious despite his earlier embarrassment. So how did you get in? Maya looked at him with something approaching approval. At least he was asking honest questions instead of making assumptions. I proved them wrong. I requested permission to attend the selection course anyway, at my own risk. If I failed, I would return to my regular unit with a negative evaluation that would likely end my career advancement. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had moved closer to the conversation, though he remained standing near the wall, observing rather than participating. The selection course was 8 weeks of physical and mental evaluation, Maya continued. Marksmanship, navigation, survival skills, psychological resilience testing. 43 candidates started the course. 12 graduated. I finished third overall. Thompson's skepticism was wavering, but his pride was still wounded. Okay, so maybe you're qualified for special ops. That still doesn't change the basic facts about men and women in combat. You're an exception, not the rule. Perhaps, Maya agreed. But that brings us back to your original statement. You said women don't get kill counts. You suggested that women are biologically incapable of effective combat performance. You implied that emotional control and physical capability are exclusively male traits. She stood up again, this time with more purpose. I'm curious, Staff Sergeant Thompson. When you made those statements, were you speaking from extensive experience working with female soldiers in combat situations? Or were you simply repeating assumptions you've heard from others? Thompson's face flushed again. I've worked with plenty of female soldiers. In combat. Well, not directly in combat, but so your expertise on women in combat comes from peacetime training and garrison duty? Maya's voice remained level, but the question cut deep. Walsh tried to help his friend. Look, Rodriguez, nobody's saying you're not a good soldier. But you have to admit that most women couldn't do what you've done. The physical requirements alone. What physical requirements are those? Maya interrupted. The ability to carry a 100-pound pack for 20 miles? Because I've done that. The upper body strength to climb obstacles and walls? Because I've done that too. Or are you referring to some other physical requirement that I might have missed? Carter, who had been quiet for several minutes, suddenly spoke up. Wait a minute. You said you had 87 confirmed kills. How long did it take to? I mean, over what time period? Maya looked at him with interest. That's actually a very good question, Private Carter. It shows you're thinking tactically about the numbers rather than just emotionally. She sat back down, but this time she turned her chair to face the rest of the mess hall, as well as the 3 men at her table. Her voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. The 87 confirmed kills were accumulated over 22 months of combat deployments. That works out to roughly 4 per month, which is actually not that unusual for someone in my position. The majority came during the Syria deployment, where the target environment was particularly rich. Thompson was struggling to maintain his composure. Even if your numbers are accurate, which I still find hard to believe, that doesn't change anything about the broader picture. You're talking about specialized operations that most soldiers, male or female, will never participate in. Maya nodded. You're absolutely right. Most soldiers will never participate in special operations. Most soldiers will never have the opportunity to accumulate high kill counts regardless of their gender. Which raises an interesting question about your original statement. She looked around the room, making eye contact with various soldiers who were listening intently. When you said women don't get kill counts, were you making a statement about opportunity, capability, or biology? Thompson opened his mouth to answer, but Maya continued before he could speak. Because if you're talking about opportunity, then you're correct. Most women don't get the same opportunities for combat operations as men. Military policy has historically limited women's access to certain roles and units. That's changing, but it's still a factor. Walsh nodded eagerly, thinking he saw an opening. Exactly. It's not about capability. It's about policy and tradition. Maya smiled again. I'm glad you bring up tradition, Corporal Walsh. Military tradition is indeed important. But I wonder if you're familiar with the tradition of women in combat throughout history. The question seemed to catch Walsh off guard. I mean, there have been some examples, but mostly women have been in support roles. Some examples, Maya repeated. Like the Soviet Union's female snipers during World War II? Lyudmila Pavlichenko had over 300 confirmed kills. Or perhaps the Kurdish YPJ fighters who have been instrumental in defeating ISIS. Or the Israeli Defense Forces, who have integrated women into combat roles for decades. Thompson was growing more agitated. Those are different situations. Different cultures, different wars. Different how? Maya asked. Are you suggesting that American women are somehow less capable than Soviet, Kurdish, or Israeli women? Or are you saying that our enemies are less dangerous than the Nazis or ISIS? Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped forward from his position near the wall. His movement immediately commanded attention from everyone in the mess hall. Sergeant Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Thompson, I've been listening to your discussion with great interest. Both soldiers immediately stood at attention, as did most of the others in the room. At ease, Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. I think this conversation raises some important points about combat effectiveness, unit cohesion, and the assumptions we make about our fellow soldiers. He looked directly at Thompson. Staff Sergeant, your service record shows courage and dedication. Your 3 deployments and 43 confirmed kills represent significant contributions to our mission success. Thompson straightened with pride, thinking he was about to be vindicated. Harrison then turned to Maya. Sergeant Rodriguez, your service record is equally impressive. Your 4 deployments and 87 confirmed kills, combined with your special operations experience, represent exceptional performance under the most challenging conditions. The lieutenant colonel looked around the mess hall, his gaze taking in every face. What troubles me about this conversation is not the discussion of combat statistics, but the underlying assumptions about what makes an effective soldier. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. In my 30 years of service, I've seen courage and cowardice, competence and incompetence, leadership and failure in every demographic group the Army includes. The idea that any single characteristic, whether it's gender, size, age, or background, determines combat effectiveness is not supported by my experience or by military research. Thompson's confidence was crumbling under his commanding officer's words, but he made one last attempt to defend his position. Sir, with respect, there are statistical differences between men and women in terms of physical capability, and statistics, Harrison interrupted, are useful tools for understanding general trends. They are not useful for making assumptions about individual capability. Sergeant Rodriguez's performance speaks for itself, as does yours, Staff Sergeant Thompson. But this conversation suggests that some of our personnel are more focused on defending their preconceptions than on evaluating their fellow soldiers based on demonstrated performance. The lieutenant colonel's words carried the weight of final judgment. The mess hall remained silent as soldiers absorbed the implications of what their commanding officer had just said. The weight of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's words settled over the mess hall like a heavy blanket. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly, very interested in their half-finished meals. Thompson stood rigidly at attention, his face a mask of barely controlled emotions. Maya remained calm, but her eyes showed the satisfaction of someone whose abilities had finally been acknowledged by the appropriate authority. Harrison gestured for everyone to sit down and resume their meals, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The casual bravado and storytelling that typically characterized mess hall conversations had been replaced by a tense awareness that something significant had just occurred. However, Harrison continued, his tone shifting slightly. This conversation has highlighted some issues that need to be addressed. Staff Sergeant Thompson, Corporal Walsh, Private Carter, I want you to report to my office tomorrow at 0800 hours. We're going to have a more detailed discussion about unit cohesion and professional conduct. Thompson's jaw clenched, but he responded with a crisp, "Yes, sir." The prospect of being called to the battalion commander's office was never good news, especially when it involved discussions of professional conduct. Harrison turned to Maya. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'd like to speak with you privately after the others have reported. There are some matters regarding your special operations experience that I'd like to discuss." Maya nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll be available at your convenience." The lieutenant colonel looked around the mess hall one final time. "I want to be very clear about something. This unit's success depends on mutual respect and professional conduct among all personnel. Assumptions based on gender, race, size, or any other personal characteristic have no place in our organization. We evaluate soldiers based on their performance, their dedication, and their contribution to mission success. Anyone who has difficulty understanding that concept is welcome to discuss it with me personally." With that, Harrison left the mess hall, his departure creating a vacuum of silence that lasted for nearly a full minute. Gradually, conversations resumed at other tables, but they were subdued and careful. Everyone understood that something important had just happened, and nobody wanted to be the next person called into the commander's office. Thompson finally sat down, his movements stiff with barely controlled anger. His two friends remained standing uncertainly until he gestured impatiently for them to join him. The easy camaraderie that had characterized their earlier conversation was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that made even basic communication difficult. Maya picked up her fork and resumed eating, apparently unaffected by the drama that had just unfolded. But several soldiers from other tables were now looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect that hadn't been there before. Word about her service record was already spreading through whispered conversations. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the supply specialist who had rolled her eyes earlier, approached Maya's table. She was a stocky woman in her mid-30s with graying hair and laugh lines that spoke of someone who had learned to find humor in military life's absurdities. "Mind if I sit down?" Santos asked. "I think we should talk." Maya gestured to an empty chair. "Please." Santos sat down and lowered her voice. "I've been in the Army for 16 years, and I've never seen anyone shut down a conversation quite like that. Where did you serve in Syria?" Maya glanced around to make sure their conversation wouldn't be overheard by Thompson's table. mostly in the western provinces. Aleppo, Idlib, some work around Damascus. Counterterrorism operations with Kurdish and government forces. Santos whistled softly. That's serious business. No wonder your numbers are so high. Those were target-rich environments with minimal collateral damage concerns. The targets were carefully selected, Maya confirmed. High-value individuals with confirmed involvement in terrorist operations or weapons trafficking. Clean shots, well-documented chains of command for verification. Santos leaned back in her chair, studying Maya with new interest. You know, I've been watching guys like Thompson spout their theories about women in combat for years. Most of the time, I just ignore it because arguing with them is like trying to teach algebra to a brick wall. But seeing someone actually shut them up with facts instead of arguments? That was beautiful. Maya smiled. And this time it was genuinely friendly. I usually don't engage either. But there was something about tonight that just pushed me over the edge. Maybe it was the way they were so confident in their ignorance. Or maybe it was the way they assumed you didn't have any experience to draw on, Santos suggested. That's what gets me. They see a woman in uniform and immediately assume she's never been anywhere or done anything dangerous. Lieutenant Jennifer Park, the military intelligence officer who had shaken her head earlier, approached their table carrying her coffee cup. Excuse me, Sergeant Rodriguez? I was wondering if I could join your conversation. Maya nodded, and Park sat down. She was a slender Asian-American woman in her late 20s with the intense, analytical look common to intelligence specialists. I wanted to apologize for not speaking up earlier, Park said. When Thompson was making those ridiculous statements about women in combat, I should have said something. But, honestly, I was curious to see how it would play out. Santos laughed. I think we were all curious. None of us expected Rodriguez here to drop that bombshell about her kill count. Park nodded. 87 confirmed kills in special operations? That's an exceptional record by any standard. Most infantry soldiers never see that level of action, regardless of gender. Maya shrugged modestly. I was in the right place at the right time with the right training. The opportunities presented themselves, and I was able to capitalize on them. Don't downplay it, Santos said firmly. Opportunity without capability means nothing. You earn those numbers through skill and dedication. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of chairs scraping across the floor. Thompson, Walsh, and Carter were standing up to leave. Thompson's face was still flushed with anger and embarrassment, and he was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. As they passed Maya's table, Thompson stopped and looked down at her. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but he apparently thought better of it and continued walking. Walsh and Carter followed without making eye contact. That's going to be a problem, Park observed quietly. Thompson's pride took a serious hit tonight. Men like him don't handle humiliation well, especially when it happens in front of an audience. Santos nodded in agreement. He's been the alpha male of this unit for months. Having a woman demonstrate superior combat experience in front of everyone, that's going to eat at him. Maya's expression grew more serious. I'm not worried about Thompson personally. He's all bluster and no real substance. But you're right that this could create unit cohesion problems. Maybe, Park said thoughtfully. But it might also have the opposite effect. Some of the younger soldiers who've been listening to Thompson's theories might start thinking more critically about their assumptions. Santos gestured toward a table of newer soldiers who were engaged in animated conversation. Look at them. They're questioning everything they thought they knew about combat effectiveness. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Maya followed Santos's gaze and noticed that several of the younger soldiers were indeed looking in her direction with expressions of curiosity and respect. Private First Class Anderson, a 19-year-old from Montana, caught her eye and nodded respectfully before returning to his conversation. The thing is, Maya said quietly, I didn't share my service record to prove a point about women in combat. I shared it because Thompson's assumptions were wrong and potentially dangerous. If he's making those kinds of judgments about female soldiers in his unit, it could affect operational effectiveness. Park leaned forward with interest. How so? If you assume that someone is incapable of performing certain tasks based on their gender rather than their demonstrated ability, you might assign them to inappropriate roles or fail to utilize their skills effectively. In combat, that kind of misallocation of resources can get people killed. Santos nodded vigorously. Exactly. I've seen supply operations fail because some commander decided that women couldn't handle the physical demands, even when the women in question were more qualified than the men who replaced them. Plus, Park added, if Thompson is in a leadership position and he's making decisions based on these kinds of biases, he's not just limiting the effectiveness of female soldiers. He's limiting the effectiveness of his entire unit. Maya picked up her water glass and took a thoughtful sip. That's what really bothered me about his comments. It wasn't just that he was wrong about women's combat capabilities. It was that his wrongness was so confident and public. Other soldiers, especially the younger ones, were accepting his statements as fact. Speaking of the younger soldiers, Santos said, lowering her voice, Carter looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him when you mentioned your kill count. I don't think he'd ever considered that a woman might have more combat experience than he's ever likely to see. Park smiled. That might actually be good for him. Carter's eager to prove himself, but he's also impressionable. Maybe hearing about your experience will make him focus more on developing his skills instead of just talking about hypothetical combat scenarios. Maya nodded. That's the hope. Though I suspect Walsh is already working to convince him that my numbers are somehow illegitimate or don't count for some reason. Walsh is Thompson's follower, Santos observed. He doesn't have many original thoughts of his own. If Thompson decides to double down on his position instead of learning from tonight, Walsh will go along with it. What do you think Harrison will say to them tomorrow? Park asked. Maya considered the question. Probably nothing too dramatic. A discussion about professional conduct, unit cohesion, the importance of basing judgments on performance rather than assumptions. But Harrison's smart enough to know that you can't change deeply held biases with a single conversation. Santos laughed. True. But you might have done more to challenge those biases in 10 minutes than a dozen formal lectures could accomplish. Park nodded in agreement. There's something powerful about having your assumptions contradicted by direct, undeniable evidence. Thompson can't argue with your service record or your kill count. He can try, Maya pointed out. And he probably will. Men like Thompson don't give up their worldviews easily, especially when those worldviews make them feel superior to others. Santos stretched and checked her watch. Well, whatever happens next, tonight was definitely memorable. I've been waiting years to see someone challenge Thompson's theories with actual facts instead of just arguments. Park stood up to leave. Sergeant Rodriguez, if you don't mind me saying so, I think you handled that situation perfectly. You stayed calm, presented facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. That's exactly how these conversations should be conducted. Maya smiled. Thank you, Lieutenant Park. Though I have to admit, there was a part of me that enjoyed seeing the look on Thompson's face when I mentioned my kill count. Santos laughed. I think we all enjoyed that part. The man had it coming. As Park walked away, Santos leaned closer to Maya. Can I ask you something personal? When you were accumulating those 87 kills, did you ever think about how it would feel to use that number to shut down someone like Thompson? Maya considered the question seriously. Honestly, no. When I was in the field, I was focused on the mission and on staying alive. The numbers were just a way of tracking mission success. It never occurred to me that I'd be using them in a mess hall conversation to prove a point about gender equality. Santos nodded thoughtfully. That's what makes tonight so powerful. You weren't trying to make a statement about women in combat. You were just sharing your actual experience. And your experience completely demolished their assumptions. Maya looked around the mess hall, which was beginning to empty as soldiers finished their meals and headed back to their barracks or duty assignments. The conversations were still more subdued than usual, and she could see small groups of soldiers discussing what they had witnessed. I just hope it leads to more thoughtful discussions about combat effectiveness, Maya said, instead of people just repeating assumptions they've heard from others. Santos gathered her tray and stood up to leave. Well, if nothing else, tonight proved that assumptions can be dangerous, and that the quiet ones are often the ones with the most interesting stories to tell. As Santos walked away, Maya finished her meal in contemplative silence. She understood that her revelation had changed something fundamental in the unit's dynamics, but she wasn't sure what the long-term consequences would be. Change was often uncomfortable, especially when it challenged long-held beliefs about identity and capability. But as she looked around the mess hall at the faces of her fellow soldiers, many of whom were still processing what they had heard, Maya felt a quiet satisfaction. Sometimes the best way to challenge ignorance wasn't through argument or debate, but through the simple presentation of truth. The next morning arrived with the usual sounds of military life. Reveille at 0530, the shuffle of boots on concrete, and the distant sound of sergeants bellowing instructions to sleepy soldiers. Maya had been awake since 0500, a habit formed during years of deployments where dawn often brought either missions or attacks. She completed her morning physical training routine in the gym, showered, and arrived at the mess hall for breakfast at 0630. The atmosphere was noticeably different from the previous evening. Conversations were quieter, and Maya noticed several soldiers glancing in her direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect to carefully concealed skepticism. Word of the previous night's confrontation had clearly spread throughout the unit, probably growing more dramatic with each retelling. Private First Class Anderson, the young soldier from Montana, approached her table during breakfast. He was tall and lanky with the earnest expression of someone who took his military service very seriously. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, standing at a modified position of attention. "May I speak with you?" Maya gestured to an empty chair. "Of course, Private Anderson. What's on your mind?" Anderson sat down but remained formally upright, clearly nervous. "Ma'am, I wanted to ask you about what you said last night. About special operations and combat experience. I've been thinking about it all night." Maya sipped her coffee and waited for him to continue. She had learned that young soldiers often needed time to formulate their thoughts, especially when discussing serious subjects. "The thing is," Anderson continued, "I've been listening to guys like Staff Sergeant Thompson talk about combat for months. Their stories about firefights and enemy contact made me think I understood what war was really like. But listening to you last night made me realize that I don't actually know anything about real combat." Maya nodded. "That's not uncommon, Private Anderson. Most soldiers form their understanding of combat from training, stories, and movies rather than actual experience. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you understand the limitations of secondhand knowledge." Anderson leaned forward slightly, his nervousness giving way to genuine curiosity. "When you were in Syria, what was it really like? I mean, beyond the numbers and the official mission descriptions." Maya considered the question carefully. Anderson was asking an honest question that deserved an honest answer, but she also knew that romanticizing combat could be as dangerous as minimizing it. "It was complicated," she said finally. "Combat itself is usually brief periods of intense action separated by long stretches of boredom, discomfort, and anxiety. The actual shooting is often the easy part. The hard part is everything that comes before and after." Anderson frowned. "What do you mean?" "Intelligence gathering, mission planning, equipment maintenance, psychological preparation. And, afterwards, mission debriefing, target verification, dealing with the emotional and mental effects of taking lives." Maya paused to let that sink in. "The trigger pulling is maybe 5% of the total process. But you were good at it," Anderson said. 87 confirmed kills means you were really good at the hard parts too." Maya smiled slightly. "I was thorough and careful. In special operations, being flashy or reckless gets you killed. Success comes from preparation, patience, and precision." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps. Staff Sergeant Thompson was approaching their table, his expression grim and his posture aggressive. He was flanked by Walsh and Carter, both of whom looked uncomfortable but determined to support their leader. "Rodriguez," Thompson said without preamble, "we need to talk." Maya looked up calmly. "Good morning, Staff Sergeant Thompson. How can I help you?" Thompson glanced at Anderson. "This is a private conversation, Private." Anderson looked to Maya for guidance. She nodded slightly, and he gathered his tray and left, but not before shooting a worried glance back at the table. Thompson sat down heavily, his bulk making the chair creak. Walsh and Carter remained standing, creating an intimidating presence that other soldiers in the mess hall began to notice. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Thompson began, his voice carefully controlled. "And I've got some questions." Maya set down her coffee cup and gave him her full attention. "I'm listening." 87 confirmed kills in special operations, Thompson said slowly. "That's a very specific number. Very detailed. Almost like you've been rehearsing it. Maya's expression didn't change. It's detailed because it's accurate. Each kill was documented through proper channels with appropriate verification. Walsh stepped forward slightly. But that's just it. Special operations documentation isn't something that regular soldiers can verify. You could claim any number you wanted, and we'd have no way to check. Maya nodded thoughtfully. That's true, Corporal Walsh. Special operations records are often classified or restricted. So you're suggesting that I'm lying about my service record? Thompson leaned forward aggressively. I'm suggesting that it's convenient that your claimed experience is in an area where verification is difficult. Very convenient. The conversation was attracting attention from other tables. Several soldiers had stopped eating to listen, and Maya could see Lieutenant Park watching from across the room with concern. Let me ask you something, Staff Sergeant Thompson, Maya said calmly. If I were going to fabricate a military record to impress people, don't you think I would choose something less exotic than special operations? Something more verifiable and relatable to regular infantry soldiers. Thompson's jaw clenched. Maybe you're smarter than I gave you credit for. Maybe you figured that claiming special ops experience would make you seem more impressive while being harder to disprove. Maya smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Or maybe I'm telling the truth about my service record, and you're having difficulty accepting that a woman might have more combat experience than you do. Carter, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. Even if your numbers are real, it doesn't prove anything about women in general. You said yourself that you're special operations. That's like 1% of the military. You can't use your experience to make claims about all female soldiers. Maya turned to look at Carter with something approaching approval. That's actually a very good point, Private Carter. You're absolutely right that individual performance doesn't prove general capability. My experience doesn't speak for all women, just as Staff Sergeant Thompson's experience doesn't speak for all men. Thompson's expression grew more frustrated. Then, what was the point of last night? If you're not trying to prove something about women in combat, why bring up your kill count? Maya leaned back in her chair, studying Thompson's face. I brought up my kill count because you made a categorical statement that women don't get kill counts. You based that statement on assumptions rather than evidence. I provided contradictory evidence. But you admit that you're an exception, Walsh pressed. So Thompson's general point still stands. Maya shook her head. No, Corporal Walsh, it doesn't. Because Thompson didn't say that most women don't get kill counts, or that the average woman doesn't get kill counts. He said women don't get kill counts. Period. As a categorical statement about female capability. Thompson's face was reddening again. Fine. Maybe I spoke too generally. But the basic principle remains true. Men are better suited for combat roles than women. Your individual success doesn't change that fundamental reality. Maya stood up slowly, her movement causing conversations at nearby tables to stop completely. The mess hall was becoming quiet again, just as it had the previous evening. Staff Sergeant Thompson, Maya said in a clear voice that carried throughout the room. You keep talking about fundamental realities and basic principles. But every time I provide evidence that contradicts your assumptions, you move the goalposts. First you said women don't get kill counts. When I proved that wrong, you suggested I was lying. When that approach failed, you argued that my experience doesn't count because it's special operations. When I agreed that individual performance doesn't prove general capability, you went back to claiming male superiority in combat. Thompson stood up as well, his height advantage making him loom over Maya. Because it's true. Look around this mess hall. Look at the size difference, the strength difference. Basic biology doesn't lie. Maya nodded slowly. You're right about physical differences, Staff Sergeant Thompson. On average, men are larger and stronger than women. Those are measurable, verifiable facts. Thompson looked pleased, thinking he had finally made his point stick. But, Maya continued, combat effectiveness isn't determined solely by size and strength. If it were, the Army would recruit from professional wrestling rather than from the general population. Intelligence, marksmanship, tactical thinking, emotional control, attention to detail, ability to work in teams, adaptability to changing situations, all of these factors contribute to combat success. Walsh shook his head. But physical capability is still the foundation. Without basic strength and endurance, all the other skills don't matter. Maya smiled. Is that your professional assessment, Corporal Walsh? Based on your extensive combat experience? Walsh's face flushed. I don't need extensive combat experience to understand basic facts about physical requirements. Actually, Maya said quietly, you do? Because combat requirements vary dramatically depending on the mission, the environment, the enemy, and the available technology. What matters in urban sniper operations is very different from what matters in mechanized infantry assault. What matters in night reconnaissance is different from what matters in convoy escort duty. Thompson was growing more agitated. You're just playing word games now. The bottom line is that when everything falls apart and bullets are flying, you want the biggest, strongest, most aggressive soldiers on your side. Maya tilted her head slightly. Is that what you wanted in Syria, Staff Sergeant Thompson? The biggest, strongest, most aggressive soldiers you could find. Thompson blinked, momentarily confused by the question. What do you mean? I mean, when you were conducting counterterrorism operations against high-value targets in urban environments, did you specifically request the largest, most physically imposing soldiers for your team? Or did you request soldiers with the specific skills and capabilities needed for the mission? Thompson's confusion was evident. I wasn't in Syria. You know that. Maya nodded. That's right. You weren't in Syria. So your understanding of what kinds of soldiers are needed for Syrian operations comes from where exactly? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth is, Maya continued, you're making assumptions about combat requirements based on your limited experience in conventional infantry operations. You're then applying those assumptions to situations you've never encountered, against enemies you've never faced, in environments you've never operated in. Lieutenant Park had moved closer to the conversation, positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary. Several other NCOs were also paying close attention, their expressions ranging from concerned to interested. Thompson's anger was becoming more visible. So what are you saying? That my combat experience doesn't count? That 3 deployments and 43 kills don't give me the right to have opinions about military effectiveness? Maya shook her head. Not at all, Staff Sergeant Thompson. Your combat experience is valuable and legitimate. But experience in one type of combat doesn't automatically make you an expert on all types of combat. Just as my special operations experience doesn't make me an expert on conventional infantry tactics. Carter, who had been following the conversation intently, suddenly spoke up. So how do we know what's really true? If everyone's experience is different, how do we figure out what works and what doesn't? Maya turned to look at him with genuine respect. That's an excellent question, Private Carter. And the answer is that we study the evidence. We look at actual performance data, mission success rates, casualty statistics, after-action reports. We base our conclusions on measurable outcomes rather than assumptions or prejudices. Thompson scoffed. And what does the evidence say about women in combat? Maya smiled. It says that female soldiers have performed effectively in every combat role they've been allowed to fill. It says that units with female soldiers have mission success rates equal to or better than all male units. It says that physical standards should be based on job requirements rather than gender, and that soldiers who meet those standards can perform effectively regardless of their demographic characteristics. Walsh looked skeptical. I find that hard to believe. If women were really as effective as men in combat, wouldn't that be common knowledge by now? Maya shrugged. Common knowledge according to whom? The same military culture that told soldiers for decades that racial integration would destroy unit cohesion? The same culture that insisted that openly gay soldiers would be unable to serve effectively? Sometimes common knowledge is just common prejudice. Thompson's face was now completely red with anger and frustration. So you're saying that thousands of years of military tradition, from ancient armies to modern special forces, have all been based on prejudice? That every culture that has used predominantly male warriors was just ignorant? Maya considered the question seriously. No, Staff Sergeant Thompson. I'm saying that thousands of years of military tradition were based on the technology, tactics, and social structures of their time. Ancient armies relied heavily on hand-to-hand combat, with edged weapons and shields. Modern armies rely on precision weapons, electronic systems, and complex coordination. The physical requirements are completely different. She gestured around the mess hall. How many soldiers in this room do you think would be effective warriors if we transported them back to ancient Rome? How many of our tactics and technologies would be useful in medieval battles? Military effectiveness has always been relative to the specific context of warfare. Carter nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying that women might be more effective in modern warfare than they would have been in ancient warfare? Maya smiled at him. I'm saying that combat effectiveness has always been determined by the match between individual capabilities and mission requirements. As warfare has evolved to emphasize different capabilities, the pool of potentially effective soldiers has expanded. Thompson made one final attempt to regain control of the argument. Fine. Maybe women can be effective in some modern military roles. But you still haven't explained why your kill count is so much higher than mine. If we're equally capable soldiers, how do you account for that difference? Maya looked at him for a long moment before responding. That's simple, Staff Sergeant Thompson. I was better at my job than you were at yours. The words hit Thompson like a physical blow. The simple, direct statement carried more impact than all of Maya's previous arguments combined. Around the mess hall, soldiers stopped pretending to eat and stared openly at the confrontation. The tension was so thick it seemed to have weight. Thompson's face cycled through several emotions: shock, anger, humiliation, and, finally, a kind of desperate rage. You arrogant, he began, stepping closer to Maya in a way that was clearly threatening. Staff Sergeant Thompson. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He had entered the mess hall unnoticed during the argument and had been observing from the doorway. Step away from Sergeant Rodriguez immediately. Thompson froze, suddenly, realizing that his body language had crossed a professional line. He took 2 steps back, but his hands remained clenched into fists. Harrison strode across the mess hall with the purposeful gait of a man accustomed to command. Every soldier in the room came to attention, creating a forest of rigid backs and straight lines. At ease, Harrison commanded, but nobody relaxed. The atmosphere was too charged for anyone to feel comfortable. Harrison looked around the room, his gaze taking in the faces of every soldier present. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 3 decades in uniform. It seems we have a communication problem in this unit, he said calmly. Some personnel appear to be having difficulty understanding the difference between professional discussion and personal confrontation. His eyes settled on Thompson. Staff Sergeant Thompson, you were scheduled to report to my office at 0800 hours. It's now 0745, and instead of preparing for that meeting, you're here creating a scene in the mess hall. Would you care to explain your priorities? Thompson's military bearing reasserted itself under his commander's direct attention. Sir, I was attempting to clarify some statements made by Sergeant Rodriguez regarding her claimed combat experience. Harrison raised an eyebrow. Her claimed combat experience? Are you suggesting that Sergeant Rodriguez has falsified her military records? Thompson hesitated, realizing that he was walking into dangerous territory. Sir, I have questions about the verifiability of certain special operations activities. Harrison nodded slowly. I see. And you felt that conducting an interrogation in the mess hall was the appropriate way to address these concerns. Sir, no sir. You were simply what, Staff Sergeant Thompson? Thompson's composure was crumbling under his commander's relentless questioning. Sir, I was trying to understand how her experience relates to general questions about women in combat roles. Harrison turned to look at Maya. Sergeant Rodriguez, do you feel that Staff Sergeant Thompson's approach to this discussion has been professional and appropriate? Maya's response was measured and calm. Sir, Staff Sergeant Thompson appears to be struggling with information that challenges his pre-existing beliefs. While I understand his confusion, I don't believe that public confrontation is the most effective way to resolve his concerns. Harrison nodded approvingly. A diplomatic response, Sergeant Rodriguez, though perhaps more diplomatic than the situation warrants. He turned back to Thompson. Staff Sergeant Thompson, you seem to be laboring under several misconceptions. First, you appear to believe that you have the authority to demand explanations from fellow NCOs about their service records. You do not. Thompson's face grew pale as he realized the full extent of his mistake. Second, Harrison continued, you seem to believe that your personal opinions about gender and combat effectiveness are somehow relevant to military policy or personnel assignments. They are not. Harrison began walking slowly around the group, his movement creating a sense of ritual formality that made every word carry additional weight. Third, and most importantly, you appear to have forgotten that this unit's effectiveness depends on mutual respect and professional conduct among all personnel, regardless of their gender, background, or individual characteristics. He stopped directly in front of Thompson. These are not matters of opinion, Staff Sergeant Thompson. These are matters of military discipline and good order. Do I make myself clear? Thompson's voice was barely audible. Yes, sir. Harrison turned to address the entire mess hall. I want everyone in this room to understand something. Questions about combat effectiveness, gender integration, and military policy are legitimate subjects for professional discussion. Personal attacks, assumptions based on prejudice, and public confrontations are not. He gestured toward Maya. Sergeant Rodriguez has shared information about her service record in response to direct challenges from fellow soldiers. That information is part of her official military file and has been verified through appropriate channels. Anyone who questions the accuracy of a fellow soldier's service record is welcome to submit their concerns through proper administrative channels. Maya remained standing at attention, but Harrison's words were clearly a vindication of her position. Around the room, soldiers were beginning to understand that Thompson had seriously overstepped acceptable boundaries. Harrison continued his address. Furthermore, I want to be very clear about something. Combat effectiveness is measured by results, not by assumptions. It is measured by mission success, unit cohesion, and the ability to adapt to changing tactical situations. It is not measured by gender, size, background, or any other demographic characteristic. He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. In my 30 years of service, I have seen exceptional soldiers and poor soldiers in every demographic category. I have seen courage and cowardice, leadership and failure, competence and incompetence in every type of person the Army includes. The idea that any single characteristic determines military effectiveness is not supported by evidence, experience, or common sense. Thompson was beginning to sway slightly, the stress of the situation finally taking its toll. Walsh and Carter looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. Harrison noticed Thompson's distress, but showed no sympathy. Staff Sergeant Thompson, your behavior this morning demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking that undermines unit effectiveness. Instead of evaluating a fellow soldier based on her demonstrated performance, you chose to attack her credibility based on your personal biases. He turned to include Walsh and Carter in his attention. Corporal Walsh, Private Carter, your participation in this confrontation is equally unacceptable. Following poor leadership is not an excuse for poor judgment. Both soldiers nodded miserably, clearly understanding that their careers had just taken a significant hit. Harrison looked around the mess hall one final time. Let me be very clear about the lessons I expect everyone to learn from this incident. First, respect your fellow soldiers based on their performance and character, not on your assumptions about their capabilities. He held up a second finger. Second, if you have concerns about a fellow soldier's qualifications or service record, address those concerns through proper channels, not through public confrontation. A third finger. Third, understand that your personal opinions about gender, race, religion, or any other demographic characteristic have no place in your professional interactions with fellow soldiers. Harrison lowered his hand. Finally, remember that this unit's success depends on every member performing to their maximum capability. When you undermine a fellow soldier based on prejudice rather than performance, you undermine the entire unit. He turned back to Thompson. Staff Sergeant Thompson, you will report to my office immediately following this formation. Corporal Walsh and Private Carter, you will report at 0900 and 0930 respectively. We will discuss your understanding of military professionalism and your future in this unit. The three soldiers nodded, their faces pale with the realization that their military careers might be in jeopardy. Harrison then surprised everyone by turning to Maya. Sergeant Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. Maya blinked in surprise. Sir, I should have addressed the unprofessional conduct in this unit before it reached this point. Your service record speaks for itself, and You should never have been put in the position of defending your qualifications to fellow soldiers. He gestured toward the table where Thompson's group had been sitting. The attitudes displayed by these soldiers reflect a failure of leadership at multiple levels. That failure stops today. Harrison looked around the mess hall one final time. I want every soldier in this unit to understand that we are moving forward with a new standard of professional conduct. Mutual respect, evaluation based on performance, and zero tolerance for discrimination or harassment. He paused for effect. Anyone who has difficulty meeting that standard is welcome to discuss it with me personally. Anyone who refuses to meet that standard will find themselves discussing it with someone else, somewhere else. The threat was clear and unambiguous. Harrison was prepared to transfer or discharge soldiers who couldn't adapt to his expectations. Now, Harrison said, his tone shifting slightly, I believe Sergeant Rodriguez was attempting to eat her breakfast before being interrupted by this unnecessary drama. I suggest we all return to our normal duties and allow her to do so in peace. Thompson, Walsh, and Carter left the mess hall immediately, their shoulders slumped with defeat. Harrison followed them, but not before nodding respectfully to Maya. The silence that followed lasted for nearly a minute. Then, gradually, conversations resumed throughout the mess hall. But the tone was different now. Soldiers were speaking more quietly, more thoughtfully. The casual bravado and prejudiced assumptions that had characterized previous discussions were notably absent. Private Anderson returned to Maya's table, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. Sergeant Rodriguez, are you okay? Maya sat down and picked up her coffee cup, which had grown cold during the confrontation. I'm fine, Private Anderson. Though I suspect this morning's excitement wasn't quite what you were expecting when you asked about combat experience. Anderson laughed nervously. No, ma'am. That was intense. I've never seen a staff sergeant get dressed down like that by a lieutenant colonel. Staff Sergeant Thompson forgot some basic principles of military conduct, Maya said calmly. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison reminded him of those principles in a very public way. Anderson nodded thoughtfully. Do you think this will change things? I mean, will people stop making assumptions about women in combat? Maya smiled, but it was a realistic rather than optimistic expression. Some people will learn from this incident. Others will double down on their existing beliefs. And some will simply be more careful about expressing their prejudices in public. But it's a start, right? Anderson asked hopefully. Maya looked around the mess hall, observing the subdued conversations and thoughtful expressions on many faces. Yes, Private Anderson. It's a start. Staff Sergeant Santos approached their table, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. She sat down without invitation, her expression serious but not unfriendly. That was quite a morning, Santos said. I've been in the Army for 16 years, and I've never seen anything quite like that. Maya nodded. It needed to happen. The attitudes Thompson was expressing were becoming more widespread in the unit. If they had been allowed to continue, they would have seriously affected our operational effectiveness. Santos raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. Well, here's to operational effectiveness. And to soldiers who judge their colleagues based on performance rather than prejudice. Maya raised her own cup. I'll drink to that. As the morning continued and soldiers gradually left the mess hall for their various duties, Maya reflected on what had transpired. She hadn't sought confrontation with Thompson, but she also hadn't backed down when challenged. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not against foreign enemies, but against ignorance and prejudice within one's own ranks. The incident would undoubtedly have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Word would spread throughout the battalion and beyond. Some would see it as proof that women could hold their own in military confrontations. Others would view it as evidence of declining standards or political correctness gone too far. But Maya understood that real change happened one conversation at a time, one challenged assumption at a time, one demonstrated capability at a time. She had done her part by refusing to accept Thompson's prejudiced statements and by presenting evidence that contradicted his assumptions. The rest would depend on how individual soldiers chose to process what they had witnessed. Some would learn and grow. Others would retreat into more sophisticated versions of their existing prejudices. But the conversation had been started, and that was something. As Maya finally finished her cold coffee and Prepared to leave for her morning duties, Private Anderson made one final comment. Sergeant Rodriguez, thank you for answering my questions about combat. And thank you for not backing down when Staff Sergeant Thompson tried to intimidate you. Maya smiled at the young soldier. Private Anderson, the most important thing you can learn from this morning is that assumptions are dangerous in military service. Assume nothing about your fellow soldiers except that they've earned the right to wear the same uniform you do. Everything else, you learn through observation and experience. Anderson nodded seriously. Yes, ma'am. I'll remember that. As Maya left the mess hall, she knew that the incident was far from over. There would be follow-up meetings, administrative reviews, and probably some awkward conversations in the days and weeks ahead. But she also knew that something important had been accomplished. The comfortable certainty that had allowed soldiers like Thompson to make categorical statements about women's combat capabilities had been shattered. It would take time to build something better in its place, but the foundation had been laid. Sometimes the most important victories weren't measured in kill counts or mission objectives, but in the slow, difficult work of changing minds and challenging assumptions. And sometimes a quiet breakfast conversation could accomplish more than months of formal training or policy statements. Maya Rodriguez had served her country with distinction in 4 combat deployments, earning 87 confirmed kills and the respect of Special Operations commanders. But her most important contribution to military effectiveness might well have been a 10-minute conversation in a mess hall, where she refused to let ignorance masquerade as expertise, and where she proved that the best response to prejudice was not anger or argument, but simple, undeniable truth.